Novel Stream presents A Vintage from Atlantis by Clark Ashton Smith. I thank you, friend, but I am no drinker of wine, not even if it be the rarest canary or the oldest amontillado. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and more than others, I have reason to know the truth that was writ by Solomon the Jewish king. Give ear, if you will, and I shall tell you a story such as would halt the half-drained cup on the lips of the hardiest bibber. We were 37 buccaneers, who raked the Spanish Main under Barnaby Dwale, he that was called Red Barnaby for the spilling of blood that attended him everywhere. Our ship, the Black Falcon, could outfly and outstrike all other craft that flew the Jolly Roger. Full often, Captain Dwale was wont to seek a remote isle on the eastward verge of the West Indies, and lighten the vessel of its weight of ingots and doubloons. The isle was far from the common course of maritime traffic, and was not known to maps or other mariners, so it suited our purpose well. It was a place of palms and sand and cuffs, with a small harbor sheltered by the curving outstretched arms of rugged reefs, on which the dark ocean climbed and gnashed its fangs of white foam without troubling the tranquil waters beyond. I know not how many times we had visited the isle, but the soil beneath many a cocoa tree was heavy with our hidden trove. There we had stored the loot of bullion-laden ships, the massy plate and jewels of cathedral towns. Even as to all mortal things, an ending came at last to our visits. We had gathered a goodly cargo, but might have stayed longer on the open main where the Spaniards passed, if a tempest had not impended. We were near the secret isle, as it chanced, when the skies began to blacken, and wallowing heavily in the rising seas, we fled to our placid harbor, reaching it by nightfall. Before dawn the hurricane had blown by, and the sun came up in cloudless amber and blue. We proceeded with the landing and burying of our chests of coin and gems and ingots, which was a task of some length, and afterward we refilled our water casks at a cool, sweet spring that ran from beneath the palmy hill not far inland. It was now mid-afternoon. Captain Dwale was planning to weigh anchor shortly and follow the westering sun toward the Caribbees. There were 9 of us, loading the last barrels into the boats, with Red Barnaby looking on and cursing us for being slower than mud turtles, and we were bending knee-deep in the tepid, lazy water, when suddenly the captain ceased to swear, and we saw that he was no longer watching us. He had turned his back and was stooping over a strange object that must have drifted in with the tide, after the storm, a huge and barnacle-laden thing that lay on the sand, half in and half out of the shoaling water. Somehow, none of us had perceived it heretofore. Red Barnaby was not silent long. "Come here, you canker-eaten coistrels," he called to us. We obeyed willingly enough and gathered around the beached object, which our captain was examining with much perplexity. We too were greatly bewildered when we saw the thing more closely, and none of us could name it offhand or with certainty. The object had the form of a great jar, with a tapering neck and a deep, round, abdominal body. It was wholly encrusted with shells and corals that had gathered upon it as if through many ages in the ocean deeps, and was festooned with weeds and sea flowers such as we had never before beheld, so that we could not determine the substance of which it was made. At the order of Captain Dwale, we rolled it out of the water and beyond reach of the tide, into the shade of nearby palms, though it required the efforts of 4 men to move the unwieldy thing, which was strangely ponderous. We found that it would stand easily on end, with its top reaching almost to the shoulders of a tall man. While we were handling the great jar, we heard a swishing noise from within, as if it were filled with some sort of liquor. Our captain, as it chanced, was a learned man. "By the communion cup of Satan," he swore, "if this thing is not an antique wine jar, then I am a bedlamite. Such vessels, though mayhap they were not so huge, were employed by the Romans to store the goodly vintages of Falernus and Secuba. Indeed, there is today a Spanish wine that of Valdepenas which is kept in earthen jars. But this, if I mistake not, is neither from Spain nor olden Rome. It is ancient enough by its look to have come from that long-sunken isle, the Atlantis whereof Plato speaks." Truly there should be a rare vintage within, a wine that was mellowed in the youth of the world before the founding of Rome and Athens, and which perchance has gathered fire and strength with the centuries. Ho, my rascal sea bullies, we sail not from this harbor till the jar is broached, and if the liquor within be sound and potable, we shall make holiday this evening on the sands. Belike, 'tis a funeral urn, full of plaguey cinders and ashes, said the mate, Roger Aglone, who had a gloomy turn of thought. Red Barnaby had drawn his cutlass and was busily prying away the crust of barnacles and quaint fantastic coral growths from the top of the jar. Layer on layer of them he removed, and swore mightily at this increment of forgotten years. At last a great stopper of earthenware, sealed with a clear wax that had grown harder than amber, was revealed by his prying. The stopper was graven with queer letters of an unknown language, plainly to be seen, but the wax refused the cutlass point. So, losing all patience, the captain seized a mighty fragment of stone, which a lesser man could scarce have lifted, and broke therewith the neck of the jar. Now even in those days, I, Stephen Magbane, the one Puritan amid that Christless crew, was no bibber of wine or spirituous liquors, but a staunch Rechabite on all occasions. Therefore I held back, feeling little concern other than that of reprobation, while the others pressed about the jar and sniffed greedily at the contents. But almost immediately with its opening, my nostrils were assailed by an odor of heathen spices, heavy and strange, and the very inhalation thereof caused me to feel a sort of giddiness, so that I thought it well to retreat still further. But the others were eager as midges around a fermenting vat in autumn. "'S blood, 'tis a royal vintage," roared the captain, after he had dipped a forefinger in the jar and sucked the purple drops that dripped from it. "Avast, ye slumgullions! Stow the water casks on board and summon all hands ashore, leaving only a watch there to ward the vessel. We'll have a gala night before we sack any more Spaniards." We obeyed his order, and there was much rejoicing amid the crew of the Black Falcon at the news of our find and the postponement of the voyage. 3 men, grumbling sorely at their absence from the revels, were left on board, though in that tranquil harbor such vigilance was virtually needless. We others returned to the shore, bringing a supply of pannikins in which to serve the wine and provisions for a feast. Then we gathered pieces of drift with which to build a great fire, and caught several huge tortoises along the sands, and unearthed their hidden eggs, so that we might have an abundance and variety of victuals. In these preparations I took part with no special ardor. Knowing my habit of abstention, and being of a somewhat malicious and tormenting humor, Captain Dwale had expressly commanded my presence at the feast. However, I anticipated nothing more than a little ribaldry at my expense, as was customary at such times, and being partial to fresh tortoise meat, I was not wholly unresigned to my lot as a witness of the Babylonian inebrieties of the others. At nightfall, the feasting and drinking began, and the fire of driftwood, with eerie witch colors of blue and green and white amid the flame, leapt high in the dusk while the sunset died to a handful of red embers far on purpling seas. It was a strange wine that the crew and captain swilled from their pannikins. I saw that the stuff was thick and dark, as if it had been mingled with blood, and the air was filled with the reek of those pagan spices, hot and rich and unholy, that might have poured from a broken tomb of antique emperors. And stranger still was the intoxication of that wine. For those who drank it became still and thoughtful and sullen, and there was no singing of lewd songs, no playing of apish antics. Red Barnaby had been drinking longer than the others, having begun to sample the vintage while the crew were making ready for their revel. To our wonderment, he ceased to swear at us after the first cupful, and no longer ordered us about or paid us any heed, but sat peering into the sunset with eyes that held the dazzlement of unknown dreams. And one by one, as they began to drink, the others were likewise affected, so that I marveled much at the unwonted power of the wine. I had never before beheld an intoxication of such nature, for they spoke not nor ate, and moved only to refill their cups from the mighty jar. The night had grown dark as indigo beyond the flickering fire, and there was no moon, and the firelight blinded the stars. But one by one, after an interval, the drinkers rose from their places and stood staring into the darkness toward the sea. Unquietly they stood and strained forward, peering intently as men who behold some marvelous thing, and queerly they muttered to one another with unintelligible words. I knew not why they stared and muttered thus, unless it were because of some madness that had come upon them from the wine, for naught was visible in the dark, and I heard nothing, save the low murmur of wavelets lapping on the sand. Louder grew the muttering, and some raised their hands and pointed seaward, babbling wildly as if in delirium. Noting their demeanor and doubtful as to what further turn their madness might take, I bethought me to withdraw along the shore. But when I began to move away, those who were nearest me appeared to waken from their dream and restrained me with rough hands. Then, with drunken, gibbering words, of which I could make no sense, they held me helpless while one of their number forced me to drink from a pannikin filled with the purple wine. I fought against them, doubly unwilling to quaff that nameless vintage, and much of it was spilled. The stuff was sweet as liquid honey to the taste, but burned like hell-fire in my throat. I turned giddy, and a sort of dark confusion possessed my senses by degrees, and I seemed to hear and see and feel as in the mounting fever of calenture. The air about me seemed to brighten, with a redness of ghostly blood that was everywhere, a light that came not from the fire nor from the nocturnal heavens. I beheld the faces and forms of the drinkers, standing without shadow, as if mantled with a rosy phosphorescence. And beyond them, where they stared in troubled and restless wonder, the darkness was illumined with the strange light. Mad and unholy was the vision that I saw, for the harbor waves no longer lapped on the sand, and the sea had wholly vanished. The Black Falcon was gone, and where the reefs had been, great marble walls ascended, flushed as if with the ruby of lost sunsets. Above them were haughty domes of heathen temples and spires of pagan palaces, and beneath were mighty streets and causeways where people passed in a never-ending throng. I thought that I gazed upon some immemorial city, such as had flourished in earth's prime, and I saw the trees of its terraced gardens, fairer than the palms of Eden. Listening, I heard the sound of dulcimers that were sweet as the moaning of women, and the cry of horns that told forgotten glorious things, and the wild, sweet singing of people who passed to some hidden, sacred festival within the walls. I saw that the light poured upward from the city and was born of its streets and buildings. It blinded the heavens above, and the horizon beyond was lost in a shining mist. One building there was, a high fane above the rest, from which the light streamed in a muddier flood, and from its open portals music came, sorcerous and beguiling as the far voices of bygone years. And the revelers passed gaily into its portals, but none came forth. The weird music seemed to call me and entice me, and I longed to tread the streets of the alien city, and a deep desire was upon me to mingle with its people and pass into the glowing fane. Verily, I knew why the drinkers had stared at the darkness and had muttered among themselves in wonder. I knew that they also longed to descend into the city. And I saw that a great causeway, built of marble and gleaming with the red luster, ran downward from their very feet over meadows of unknown blossoms to the foremost buildings. Then, as I watched and listened, the singing grew sweeter, the music stranger, and the rosy luster brightened. Then, with no backward glance, no word or gesture of injunction to his men, Captain Dwale went slowly forward, treading the marble causeway like a dreamer who walks in his dream. And after him, one by one, Roger Aglone and the crew followed in the same manner, going toward the city. Haply I too should have followed, drawn by the witching music, for truly it seemed that I had trod the ways of that city in former time, and had known the things whereof the music told and the voices sang. Well did I remember why the people passed eternally into the fane, and why they came not forth, and there, it seemed, I should meet familiar and beloved faces, and take part in mysteries recalled from the foundered years. All this, which the wine had remembered through its sleep in the ocean depths, was mine to behold and conceive for a moment. And well it was that I had drunk less of that evil and pagan vintage than the others, and was less besotted than they with its luring vision. For, even as Captain Dwale and his crew went toward the city, it appeared to me that the rosy glow began to fade a little. The walls took on a wavering thinness, and the domes grew insubstantial. The rose departed, the light was pale as a phosphor of the tomb, and the people went to and fro like phantoms, with a thin crying of ghostly horns and a ghostly singing. Dimly above the sunken causeway the harbor waves returned, and Red Barnaby and his men walked down beneath them. Slowly the waters darkened above the fading spires and walls, and the midnight blackened upon the sea, and the city was lost like the vanished bubbles of wine. A terror came upon me, knowing the fate of those others. I fled swiftly, stumbling in darkness toward the palmy hill that crowned the isle. No vestige remained of the rosy fight, and the sky was filled with returning stars. And looking oceanward as I climbed the hill, I saw a lantern that burned on the Black Falcon in the harbor, and discerned the embers of our fire that smoldered on the sands. Then, praying with a fearful fervor, I waited for dawn. Thank you for listening.